Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel. With your hosts Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another scintillating, dramatic session of Truth Be Told.
If you do say so yourself.
I hope the screenwriters gave us a good script today.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Today is September the 7th, 2022. Mike, I didn't ask you before we came on, but this week in Modesto, in the Central Valley of California, is supposed to be the hottest week of the whole year. And we're in September. Usually it's June, July, and August that's our hottest days. Wow. But for some reason, there's a late hot spell that's come through. And yesterday, Modesto was the coolest place in the entire, 300 miles plus of the length of the Central Valley. We were only 110 degrees. Some places were like 115. And when I noticed on my smartphone about 5 o'clock yesterday, it reached 110. I told my wife, I said, I want to go outside and feel what 110 degrees feels like. So she came out with me. And I had said for years that once you get over 100, you really don't notice much difference. I noticed a difference. It was stifling. It was overwhelming. It was just brutal. And today's only supposed to be 107. So this entire week is like this extreme heat wave. Yesterday, they were thinking it might break the all-time record of any date ever in Central California. I think it may have come just a couple of degrees short of an all-time record. And so it's this time next week supposed to be in the 80s. So we're looking forward to that. But this is pretty brutal. And long about 5 o'clock, my wife, both of our phones sent this alert. And I guess everyone in California got it. Southern California is just about as hot. Even the coastline is really hot for them, like 90 or so. So it's really bad everywhere in California, which means, huge demand of electricity. And so they sent out this alert to everyone, said there might be rolling blackouts. So we were expecting to lose our electricity all evening, but it never happened. So it may happen these next couple of days. But the funny, not funny, funny, you want to just slap yourself kind of thing in California is on one day, the other day, our governor comes out and says, we've just passed a new law. I don't even think the legislature was involved. Maybe they were. That by 2030, I think it is, they will not sell any more gas-powered cars. It's going to be all electric after that. And then the very next day is when this heat wave started, and they come out and they said, all of you who own electric vehicles, please do not plug them in to recharge this afternoon because it may overwhelm the power grid. Talk about a joke. Talk about
He doesn't see it. None of them see it.
Well, even if they do see it, they don't care because, as you well know, this whole climate change thing that's going on and environmental stuff connected to it that's really socialism in disguise is a religion, has become a religion.
Yes, it is.
And it has the religious zeal connected to it. And it has the religious blindness connected to it. That no matter what, even if there is a price to pay now, even in lives, or in bankrupting people practically. I mean, I joke about this to people, but I have to laugh instead of cry. that the last couple of months, because we're on all PG&E for electric and gas, and their rates are really high. And I refuse to live in a hot house anymore. I grew up in a hot house. I slept in a hot house. So
Yes.
I'm just going to pay whatever it costs not to
Yeah.
have to live in a hot house.
Yeah.
So I tell people I have to take out a second mortgage just to pay my PG&E bill every summer.
Yeah.
And it's not too far off.
Yeah. And then a third mortgage to pay the gasoline for the car.
Yeah, that. And so, in fact, I read, where is that? I just read this in, maybe it's another country. Maybe it's in Europe. I think it's in Europe, Northern Europe somewhere, one of the Scandinavian socialist countries.
Yeah.
At their national bank, I think it's within a few years from now, will not provide any car loans for a gas-powered vehicle. They'll only provide car loans for electric vehicles. And yet, we've all read the stories about how dependent electric vehicle batteries are on the coal industry and fossil fuel industry.
Yes.
And how expensive those batteries are to replace, almost as much as the whole car.
It's a farce. It really is.
But it's a religion, and they really feel like they're saving the planet, as if man can do that.
Right.
For saving the planet. So whatever it costs in the short term, even if it costs, with this, where the farmers over in the Netherlands are protesting and going on strike, which is not their nature usually to do so, because the government has decided that in order to meet our desired levels of fossil fuel dependence, we're going to cut way back on the amount of fertilizer that can be purchased and used. And the farmers are saying, if you insist on this demand this soon, within a few years, we will be able to produce maybe only 50% of the food we produce now. Are you willing to let your people starve, farms go bankrupt, destroy the country, the economy, just so that you can feel good about yourself of saving the planet?
Yeah.
But I really think it is that entrenched in some of these people that they think the good of what is in their power to do of saving this planet is worth any short-term cost.
Absolutely.
And
so
that's kind of where we're headed.
And if it's only 50%, you can be certain that they'll get their food.
Yes. That verse in Revelation, I know there's different interpretations of what it means, but when it talks about the high price for grain to make bread and everything, it's going to be sky high. But then it says, do not harm the oil or the wine. And that's a real interesting
That
statement.
is interesting, yeah.
And I know there's different opinions as to what it means. But I think, but it's there in the context of famine.
Yeah.
And I think one thing it means is that during any famine, the poor people and the regular people who cannot afford food are going to starve, the grain, the bread. But the wealthy, signified by the oil and wine, or the finer things, they'll always have theirs.
Yes.
They never deprive themselves.
Yeah.
And some of them might say, well, I gave $100 million last year to this charity. Yeah, that only leaves you about $5 billion still, so your lifestyle doesn't change a bit.
Yeah.
But someone in the middle class or the lower middle class or the poor, as you start being $10 a loaf for bread, that begins to really affect you.
Absolutely.
So,
And then another scripture I thought of when you're talking about the heat is somewhere in Revelation talks about the sun scorched the earth.
Scorching.
Yeah. And men were just basically shaking their fist at God.
Yeah.
So you can imagine all the batteries that are going to melt during that time of their cars.
Whatever is happening with the climate and how it's being used for evil by the rulers of this world, The environment itself, weather itself, natural disasters are all going to be part of the Great Tribulation.
Yes.
And God's anger toward mankind, and how he brings about the Great Tribulation, how the man of sin will take advantage of all that.
Yeah.
Claims that I'm sure part of his claims will be that he has the solution to the environmental problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so they may be real. I mean, there may be, it's like this hottest week ever. The hottest week this year is in September, which is really strange for California.
Yeah.
That may be commonplace.
Mm-hmm.
And the environmentalists, the socialists will be able to take that to push their agenda.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, as we've talked about so many times, God is also using it for his purposes.
Yes. Yes.
To bring about judgment.
Well, you said it was a religion. And so basically he's taking their religion and he's turning it back around on them.
Mm.
And many are going to die as a result. And so even in our discussion here with the golden calf, they, as we'll see, they worship that, and it's spelled death.
Let's jump into that then.
Okay, yeah.
We don't want all our younger brethren to accuse us of weather and politics the whole session.
Not the whole session.
So we're in Exodus 32, and we're going through Genesis and Exodus, of course, mainly looking for Christ and the gospel and the applications to him and his people. And a lot of great lessons for us in these stories. And this famous story of the golden calf in chapter 32. I want to set the context briefly, because our last session was chapter 31, and the artisans, or the workmen, the crafts, what do you call them? Craftsmen?
Craftsmen, Old King James, yeah.
Yeah, the Old King James. Craftsmen that God called and filled with his spirit to build the tabernacle and the furnishings. And they were skilled laborers in the truest sense of the word, directed by the Spirit. And so they were spiritual artisans. Bezalel was kind of the head of it, and other men, Holiab was one of the others, and they kind of directed those men in charge of producing all of that. It's interesting that Bezalel was of the tribe of Judah instead of Levi. So we talked about how that Judah and Levi were kind of merged together in this project.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
The idea of king priest being merged in this important spiritual project. But the point I want to make in context in regard to the golden calf is that this idea of Bezalel produced works directed by the Spirit. It was his hands. It required physical labor, but it was Spirit directed. Therefore, it was holy and godly, even though it was physical labor. And that's the context that we need to look at chapter 32, because chapter 32 is the works of their own hands in their own human nature, not directed by the Spirit. In fact, in rebellion against the Spirit.
Yes.
And so that larger context of Bezalel doing the work of God at God's direction, and then in chapter 32, the majority of the people doing their own works. In fact, Stephen in Acts 7, when he's talking about this golden calf incident, he said they rejoiced in the work of their own hands. And that's what the golden calf was, the work of their own hands. So in the larger context of the Bible, these two chapters help explain the central truth of doing the work of God at his direction, guided by his Spirit, as willing vessels, that's Bezalel, and doing what may appear to be similar work, but directed by our own pride, our own energy, our own glory. That's what the golden calf was all about.
Yeah.
rejoiced in the work of their own hands.
Yeah.
So the idea of our works versus God's works through us is kind of what these two chapters are about. And that's really important to understand. You know, I'm guilty, as probably most all of us are. I have preached and taught on the golden calf before. And like we often do with these famous stories, if we're not careful, we isolate it from everything in the larger context of what came before and what comes after. So we look at it as if it's a standalone story, but it's
Right.
not a standalone story.
Right.
It is to be a contrast and compare with the story of God calling these craftsmen to do his work directed by his spirit, as opposed to those who came along with their own idea, their own efforts, and they're basically forming their own rival religion. Like what we were talking about of environmentalism today is a rival religion, where it puts man at the core of things rather than God. It's humanistic instead of God-centered. It's man-centered, and that man has the solution. You know, they said these are the gods that delivered us from Egypt. Instead of giving the true God glory, they built an idol with their own hands and declared it to be the one who had helped them. And that's what the religion of humanism is elevating man.
Yes.
To be able to save himself in some fashion. And that's what we're facing today with the high-tech companies and the politicians and the media, all of them joining forces, basically saying, we don't need God to find the solutions to our problems. God says, that is the cause of your problems.
Yes.
You're looking to yourself.
Yes.
That's the core of your problems.
Yes.
So that goes back to the Tower of Babel that we had earlier lessons on. That whole spirit of saying we don't need God for our survival, for our future. We can do it ourselves.
You know, I wonder too how much influence this mixed multitude had upon Aaron. You know, Israel had this seed among the people, whatever that mixed multitude was comprised of. It just seems like they were that ever-present thorn. And when we start mixing a godly race or godly people and the plans that God has for them, you start folding in others on the outside. It spells trouble.
Well, and you're right. The calf figure or bull figure or ox figure was a real common idol figure among pagans.
Yeah.
It signifies strength, it signifies productiveness, as far as meat and milk and all that. And so that was a real common idol figure, and it was a real common one in Egypt too. So that mixed multitude brought that along with them. It is interesting that when they talked Aaron into helping them build this, fashion this, that he said in verse 5, when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation, said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord, to Yahweh." It's kind of perplexing in some way why he would agree to build an idol and yet said it's a feast to Yahweh. You have any thoughts on that? What it seems like
Absolutely
trying to mix both.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the deception. Underneath the surface, it is a deity to rival Yahweh. On the surface, to maybe placate his own conscience or the people, you pronounce it as a viable sacrifice unto God. And this is what we're seeing today, even among the Lord's churches, is this undercurrent, a rival God, and that God is self. lose your personal salvation, and you don't get it back unless you erect to yourself these gods or these works that you declare are acceptable to Yahweh. It's the same principle we're seeing even today.
So in a sense, Aaron was trying to play it both ways, and he was trying to do what a lot of people do today, doing that which is opposed to God, but then dressing it up in righteous clothes.
Yes.
Trying to sanitize it and sanctify it,
Yeah.
and say this is really for the Lord, when underneath we know it's not really.
Yeah.
But
the Apostle Peter had a phrase for those. He says, "These are spots in your feast." They don't belong there.
It's kind of like what Brother Dillard said in our interview a few weeks ago, when he used to travel to lots of different churches promoting the orphanage and the schools and things that he was involved in, and how that he would leave, and his wife, what'd you say? Don't say it. He'd say, I've got to say it.
Yeah.
Said, what was his words? You could hear the same thing in the Protestant church down the street. Did you hear anything different here in a Landmark Baptist church than you could hear in a Protestant church down the street? And his point was, it's not just always what is preached, but what is not preached, what is left out.
Yeah, what's left out. Yeah.
And we're seeing this today, this rise. I don't think we give it enough credence or credit. This rise in our lifetime of independent but conservative types of churches who do believe strongly in the inspiration of Scripture. They may teach a pretty clear salvation message. They teach godly living. Our minds are quite strict and narrow. And so our people kind of get connected to them on the internet often, or attend different special, meetings, or a lot of our kids might go to private schools, Christian schools, and they start going to the functions. And then you start hearing your own people say, they're really close to us in their beliefs. I haven't heard anything from them that's really any different than what we believe. Well, that tells me two things. That tells me that maybe that person is not grounded like they should be. But it also tells me maybe we pastors aren't doing good enough job to explain the differences that make us distinct from the Protestants.
Right, from the tares.
Yeah. The tares look like the wheat. And the wheat says, hey, those tares look like they're wheat to us. And I'm hearing that more and more because the differences maybe are not spelled out clearly enough. Or maybe those listening just aren't listening well enough, or something. There's a breakdown somewhere that can be able to be said, and that Aaron could say, this is a holy feast to Yahweh, when they're standing there looking at a golden calf. He was able to dress it up, It's just kind of this odd thing. We see it as rebellion against Yahweh, but he somehow saw it as a mixture, or a somehow paying respect to Yahweh. And we're not given all the details, but you wonder if some of it was that he knew he was going to have to answer to his brother when Moses came off the mountain. So he was trying to mix it together enough to where he had a little bit of an out with his brother. Not quite sure.
Yeah. They didn't realize that Yahweh was a jealous God, and this was a clear act of disloyalty. They did not bring, these gods did not bring them out of Egypt. Yahweh did by his mighty hand. And so that was really an act of disloyalty, treason against him, to ascribe their coming out of Egypt by the power of these gods.
Another thing connected with Bezalel, So we're trying to put this in context of chapter 31 of doing God's work directed by the Spirit versus trying to do God's work or thinking you're doing God's work by your own efforts and wisdom. Evidently, we're told back in chapter 24 and 14 when Moses went up into the mountain, he told them, he said, Aaron and Hur will be here to direct you and help you while I'm up on the mountain. So we're not really told here, but evidently Hur, based on that, was in agreement or at least did not object. He was one of the main leaders along with Aaron in charge while Moses was gone. Did Hur help Aaron in this project? I think it would be correct to conclude he did. And yet back in 31 and 2, we're told that Hur is the grandfather of Bezaleel. So at the same time you have Bezaleel being called and empowered to do God's work God's way, his grandfather may have been involved in this rebellion, at the same time. And it's just this thought, came to me of the important role of grandparents. You and I are grandparents, and the special relationship we have with our grandchildren. And so Hur knew about this calling of his grandson to be in charge of the workers of the tabernacle. And yet he may have been involved in helping to set up this rival religion at the same time, at a time when he could have taken a stand and said, what we're doing is not right. But evidently didn't. And I don't know that I'm reading too much into it, but the fact that Moses had placed her along with Aaron in charge while he was gone tells me he may have been involved in this also.
Is he mentioned? He's not mentioned in this narrative, but is he mentioned later on? I don't recall.
I don't think so. I'm just thinking back when chapter 24:14, Moses told the elders before he went up on the mountain, he said, wait here for us until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has a difficulty, let him go to them. So they were the two main ones in charge. So even though he's not mentioned in chapter 32 of playing a direct role, at best, he did not take a stand against it.
Right.
He tried to remain neutral or something at best.
Well, it just goes to show you that strong leadership, consistent leadership is crucial. I think today too, as we head on to the events of the end time, Great Tribulation, it's going to take strong leadership.
Yes.
To point the way, forge the way,
So these people ask Aaron to make us gods, and he took off told him to break off the golden earrings in verse 2. So they broke off the golden earrings. They brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand in verse 4, and he fashioned. You see, that stands out to me, verse 4. He fashioned it with an engraving tool. That's in contrast to Bezaleel, who also used tools to fashion the furnishings of the tabernacle. Chapter 37 and 38, we went through it a little bit last time, where it goes into great detail about Bezaleel made the Ark of the Covenant, and then he made the altar of incense, he made the table of showbread, he made this and that, all the holy things of the tabernacle. And Bezaleel fashioned them by the Spirit of God. Now here, Aaron fashioned them with an engraving tool, and he made a molded calf. So there's just contrast between him and Bezaleel, I think, is interesting.
And who's watching Aaron all along? his sons.
Mm. Yeah.
So he influenced
Yes, he did.
2 of them in a bad way.
So, what a story of contrast between these 2 chapters. And, you've no doubt taught on this many times. I have also, and we've heard many people talk about this story. And it's easy to be, really tough on them, and we should be tough on them. God was tough on them.
Mm-hmm.
But then the question can be asked, where would we be in this story? Where would we be? Because
Which side of the line would we be on?
What side of the line would we be on?
Yeah.
Because it reminds me of a scenario that's often asked. If you were an average German citizen in the late 30s, early 40s, sitting in your Lutheran pews every Sunday, singing gospel hymns, hearing a gospel message from the pulpit, would you then be in the concentration camps on Monday, leading those Jews to the gas chambers, thinking they're not even human, or taking them to the doctors to perform those medical experiments? And we all would like to think that we would not be that kind of person. But I've read stories where those good Christian German Lutherans sitting in those pews singing those gospel hymns, they would sometimes hear the train whistles, those trains taking those Jews to the concentration camps. And it kind of triggered their consciences. So what do? They just sang louder to drown out the noise, to salve their conscience. Because they knew the next day they would be in those concentration camps, leading those Jews to the gas chambers. And would like to think that we would not be like that. But what, 98% of the average German citizen went along with it.
Yeah.
It's amazing what national group peer pressure can do. And how it goes back to Aaron saying this is a feast to Yahweh. How that we find ways to justify it, we find ways to sanctify it, we find ways to explain it away, we find ways to try to salve our own conscience while we're in the middle of doing something really rebellious against God.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, we'd like to think that we would not be among the majority here, dancing and singing around this golden calf.
Here's how I kind of think about it. To answer your question, where would we be? We don't know 100%, of course, but we're in a battle today. And you and I have talked about this battle. And in the heat of this battle, where you've got people falling left and right, different isms and schisms, you and I, among others, have taken a hardline stand. So we've drawn a line in the sand, pertinent to our own circumstances that we're facing. And so they erected this calf, and many of them got swept up in it, all the excitement and this and that, and were deceived, and therefore they danced around the calf. But not all of them danced around the calf. So we've got people now around us dancing around the calf of their own works, the calf of this, the calf of that. But we've drawn a line in the sand, you and I. So I would like to think that if our character is such with our circumstances today, and we've taken a stand because we see what's going on, I would like to think that if we were back then, we would have been among those who did take a stand in that crowd. I would like to think that.
Well, and some did, didn't they?
And some did.
The sons of Levi took a stand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this was not the whole nation. This probably was the vast majority, but it wasn't the whole nation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have to, commit in your heart ahead of time.
What's interesting is how many do we estimate, say around this time that came out? A couple of million, are we thinking?
Yeah. We usually say about 2.5 million.
2.5 million, and yet only 3,000 are slain. So that's a small percentage of those that danced around the calf. But they may have been like the ringleaders, the main instigators, We'll get to that part. There's more to talk about when we get to that part.
Yeah, overall, this whole chapter speaks about some pretty major themes.
Yes.
One, it speaks about how easily and quickly God's people can apostatize if we don't take guard.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And number two, it speaks about Moses as intercessor. That's a really important part of this story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But even larger than that, it speaks about this combination that the Bible deals with a lot of God's mercy and God's judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Or as Paul said in Romans 11, consider the severity of God.
Yes.
And the goodness.
And the
God.
Goodness. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he blends both together in this story.
Yeah. Yeah.
He could have been more severe than he was.
Well, he could have killed Aaron.
Yeah, he could have. Yeah.
But Aaron got a pass on this, and my thoughts on that are, at best, this whole structure and the people involved in it are inferior. They're still sinners. So with the very first high priest, you're already pointing out that we need a better high priest. Yes. We need one who won't do this, who would never do this.
Yeah, faithful high priest.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Another thing to bring out in this story, instead of just reading through all the verses, is that what they used to form this golden calf was the gold that they brought out of Egypt.
Yeah.
That was intended to be sanctified for use in the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
And instead they used a portion of it to build this golden calf. So there's a lot to be said about misusing God's blessings, using God's blessings for evil instead of good, using it for our glory instead of his. And, you just wonder, even our finances, our possessions, everything God has blessed us with, are we using it for him, or are we using it for ourselves?
Yeah.
And there's a lot, even using it for ourselves in idolatrous ways. Because when you put yourself at the center of your universe, you have built yourself, you've made yourself an idol.
Yes.
You are the golden calf.
Yeah, you are that God.
You dance around.
Yes, right. Yes. Yes. And you're right. So we have this finger pointing toward Israel, but we got four fingers pointing back, right?
At least.
At least.
So Moses is up. It's just so interesting, isn't it? Moses is up receiving the law from God, receiving God's commandments. At the same time, they are in the process of breaking those same commandments, especially the first ones. They probably broke many of the laws in this, because we're not, when it says in verse, at the end of verse 6, they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. That's probably kind of a sanitized version of what was really taking place.
Right, yeah.
Because it says in verse 25, when Moses saw that the people were unrestrained, for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame among their enemies. There really is something about idolatry, pagan religion, that almost always promotes deviancy of the sexual nature, which was probably a big part of what was going on here.
Oh yeah, it was an orgy.
Yeah, it was an orgy of some
Yeah.
type.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to me that something very basic about idolatrous paganism almost leads quickly to that.
Yes. Yes.
It's so closely connected to that practice. So
Yes.
Paul dealt with that so much in his travels and writes about it in his letters to Ephesus and to Corinth and all those huge pagan cities where he helped form churches.
Mhm.
He had to write a lot about sexual practices of
Yes.
fornication and adultery and other
Yes.
forms of fornication
Well, it's a
that
basic
seems
need.
to be steeped in
Yes.
paganism.
It's a basic human need, like food.
Yeah.
So it's a primal need.
A
Okay.
primal. That's a good way to put
Yes.
it. A primal need, and
Yeah.
paganism feeds into the primal
Yes.
nature.
Yeah.
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 So this was there was a lot more going on here than just singing and dancing.
Right. 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 Yeah. It wasn't bluegrass music. Okay. You know. But now your verse read a little differently. Read that verse again.
At the end of verse
25.
6,
20,
verse 25,
yeah.
it says, "Now when Moses saw that the people were unrestrained."
Okay.
What's
Oh,
the
King
old
James
King
says naked. I didn't look that up, but
Oh, it says naked?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably closer to the idea.
Yeah.
But unrestrained would involve more than nakedness is for the way were they getting naked, you know.
The result of the unrestraint.
Yeah,
Yeah.
unrestrained.
Yeah.
And it was to their shame
Mm-hmm.
at the end of verse 25. Is that what yours says? To their shame?
Yes, unto their shame among their enemies.
Mm-hmm. So you can imagine Moses is up communing with God, you know, 40 days, perfect fellowship.
Oh, I know. Yes.
And then he comes down to see this, just the opposite. So what God wanted for them was what Moses was experiencing on the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
But what they were doing was just the opposite. So God tells Moses to get down. The people have corrupted themselves in verse 7.
Mm-hmm.
And look at verse 8. This is why we need to really, as the Bible calls it, take heed to yourselves. In verse 8, they have turned aside quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It can happen quickly, can
Mm-hmm.
it?
It happens with the wrong relationship. It happens with the wrong aspiration, wrong motive, wrong set of goals. It doesn't take much to turn someone's head.
No, it doesn't. And that our old flesh nature is, what did God tell Cain? Sin is at your door, ready like a wild animal
Yes.
to jump on you and slay you.
Yes. Yes. So, and really, as a pastor, Moses leading this flock of sheep, you're right. He's on this spiritual high. I mean, he's just drinking it all in. He's, him and God are like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
He comes down and he's just brokenhearted as to this high just dissipated like a vapor in front of him. And really, as pastors, we really want to have our flock experience what we experience in our leadership. When we are fellowshipping with God, or we just we're in His Word, it's just wonderful, and we just want to try to instill that into the flock. And it's frustrating at times when they don't see it that way.
Well, it's just so interesting how quickly our flesh nature can grab hold and control us if we're not careful.
Yes.
And
even the leadership, as we see in her and Aaron.
Yeah, this would have been a golden opportunity, no pun
No
intended,
pun intended.
for Aaron and her to try to put a stop to it. I mean, they
Yes.
may have been in fear for their lives. These people were almost out of control right from the start.
Mhm.
But still, I mean, are we supposed to risk our lives at some point if necessary?
Yeah.
And I mean, just think what an example, what an inspiration, what a source of strength and encouragement this would have been for all generations to come, to be
Yes.
able to look back at this story and see how the Aaron and her stood in the gap,
Mm.
said, "Don't do this evil deed." The people took up stones and killed them.
Mhm.
Yet how many people would benefit from Aaron and her's courage and faith if they
Mhm.
had done that instead of going along with this?
Mhm.
So it's we love the Lord's people as pastors. We devote our lives to try to feed them and help them and everything.
Mhm.
And Moses did say in one place, "I wish all the people of God had the Spirit of God."
Mhm.
And so we can learn a lot from
Mhm.
other people of God, what they've studied, what they've learned, and listen to their advice. But a pastor has to be extremely careful about listening to the people too much.
Mhm.
Meaning not just listening to them, but listening to them for the purpose of, your finger in the air to see which way the wind is blowing among the
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
And then you go that way
Mhm.
to make it look like you're leading them,
Right. Yeah.
but it's really according to their will. And you need to be able to see when your people are headed toward danger, be able to put a stop sign in front of them
Yes. Yes.
instead of saying, "Well, that's kind of what they chose, so I'm going to go along with them."
Mhm.
I mean, a part of being a leader is to be able to throw up the roadblocks, the speed
Right.
bumps,
Yes. Yes.
the
Yeah.
yield sign, those
Yeah.
kind of things that
Yeah.
can help them stop and realize that the majority often is wrong,
Mhm.
and they need somebody
Mhm.
to stand up and say, "You're headed in the wrong direction."
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a lonely place to be, but it's an important place to be.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's not a glorified job. It has its blessing, obviously. Uh, but when you see people respond and they become the disciples that they're reaching their potential, uh, but our reward will be in the end, how it all shakes out.
We watch for their souls.
Yes, we watch for their souls. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
So God told Moses to get down, and God's angry, of course. And he said in verse 10, "Let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation." So the question might be asked, was God really serious about this, or was this mainly a test for Moses to see how
Mhm.
Moses would respond?
Mhm.
So on one hand, you could say, well, if God killed all of them, so um, verse 10 lets us know that even though only 3,000 were killed, there may have been a lot more involved, or at least influenced by what the 3,000 did. We're willing to either go along with it or not take a stand against it, because it appears that he was willing to destroy much of the nation, and make a nation out of Moses. You say, well, on one hand, it would still be from the bloodline of Abraham, so he could still continue, wouldn't be in violation of the promises he made to Abraham. But then on the other hand, if he destroyed all of them and started with Moses, then there's no tribe of Judah, the bloodline of Christ.
Mhm.
So it appears a lot of this is for the purpose of testing Moses as the leader,
Mhm.
how he would respond. And he responded as the mediator, as a type of Christ.
Mhm.
And in essence, God made that charge against the whole human race. Let me destroy, they deserve to be destroyed. And Jesus stepped in and said, no, let me take their place. Now that's what
Mhm.
Moses pretty much did. I'm willing to pay the price. Please, change your mind and don't kill them.
Mhm.
So this is a really good picture of Christ.
And then a reference to the nations again, as was mentioned earlier. What verse was it where there was a reference to the enemies of Israel?
Oh yeah, back in verse 25, to their shame among their enemies.
Uh-huh. And that's what Moses was concerned about, God's reputation.
So he's a good example of what a pastor is to be, is
Mhm.
basically saying, God, I know they deserve your wrath, but please have mercy on them.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because that's what
Yeah.
love does.
Yes. Yes. Covers a multitude of sins.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we see God honoring that tender heart and not proceeding with, plan A, shall we say.
So it's interesting that down in verse 16, back to this idea of the works of God and the works of man. Now the tablets were the work of God.
Mm.
So it's showing the contrast of the golden calf, the work of man, and the tablets were the work of God.
Mm-hmm.
And then poor Joshua, he's with Moses near the mountain. And so Joshua hears the noise of the people. And he said, there's a noise of war in the camp. So he kind of misread it.
Yeah.
Moses had to help him. No, that's not
Yeah.
war.
Yeah.
That's something different than war. That's a big party going on.
He had military ears.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, Moses intervened for them, became the mediator before he got back to the camp and saw it with his own eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When he got back to the camp and saw it with his own eyes, he became as angry as God was. That's down in verse 19.
Uh-huh.
So, he realizes, well,
oh, I see what you mean.
I say, yeah, I see what you mean, God. This is terrible.
Maybe I spoke in haste.
And he took those tablets that he just brought down from the mountain and threw them down and broke them, which is, very symbolic, isn't
Very
it?
symbolic, yes.
That
yeah.
They already broke the commandments before the commandments were delivered to them. Mm-hmm. in these tablets of stone. Had already broken them. And so it's almost, I know it's not intended to be humorous, but just from our,
right.
removed standpoint, it's humorous that he took the calf in verse 20, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the children of Israel drink it. It's kind of like when they said, we're tired of this manna that you've given us. We want meat.
Yes.
So he gave them so many quails until they vomited it out of their nose.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Psalms talks about he gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. Mm-hmm. Sometimes God gives us what we want,
yes,
to our own harm, just to teach us.
Just to teach us, yeah.
But you wonder, how did he force them to drink this water that they knew would be unhealthy and taste terrible? How do you get somebody to actually drink water? But it's almost as if his display of emotion and anger was so dramatic that they were going to do anything he demanded of them at this point. They were so scared of him.
or they had one guy on their left, another guy on their right, having jerked their head back and their mouth open.
So all they saw at this point in Moses was his anger.
Mhm.
They didn't see his intercession for
Right.
them
Right.
before God.
Yeah.
So they only saw one side of it. And sometimes the people of God only see one side. And the pastor is pleading with God behind the scenes, but when he comes out in public, he
Yeah.
rebukes.
Yeah.
So they only
Yeah.
see that part.
Yeah. When Jesus comes back with flaming fire, a sword, and all that, they'll see him in that vein. But what they'll have forgotten is that he died on the cross for them prior to that.
Mm-hmm. So now Moses takes off after Aaron in verse 21. What did this people do to you that you have brought so great a sin upon them? So he doesn't let his brother off the hook.
Right.
And this
Yeah.
is his older brother. So
Right.
it's kind of hard for a younger brother to
Yeah.
rebuke an older brother, but he calls him out on it. And, Aaron's response is really interesting. Verse 22, it's kind of like, come on, baby brother, don't make such a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
Come on, let's just sweep this away and move on. Don't get.
Yeah.
So that's what he says. Don't let the anger of my Lord become hot. You settle down. You know the people that they are set on evil. So they said, make us gods that go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not want what's become of him. And this is another kind of humorous. And I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me. I cast it into the fire, and this calf came out.
Magic.
So it's what we do. We try to minimize the sin.
Yes.
We try to make it less than what it is. Instead of just admit it, confess it, repent.
Right.
But he's trying to make it something smaller than what it was. And so that's when Moses makes that famous statement, whoever's on the Lord's side, let him come to me. All the sons of Levi gathered themselves to him. So this is the tribe that Aaron and Moses came from.
Yeah.
And their leader, one leader, Aaron, was the leader of the rebellion, and their other leader, Moses, issues this challenge. So to the tribe of Levi's credit, they chose the right leader, didn't they?
Yeah.
They chose Moses over the high priest.
And the irony is that they killed 3,000 who danced around the calf, but they didn't kill the one who fashioned the calf.
It is interesting. So Moses, after 3,000 of them fell, that'd make a pretty dramatic effect. 3,000. I mean, that would affect a lot of families, evidently from every tribe.
I've often wondered, is that number significant? 3,000. We've gone over numbers and such in our previous episodes. I don't know. Does anything strike you as far as 3,000?
Well, I do have a thought on that, actually.
Oh, pray tell.
Well, I don't know if there's an exact connection, but I do find it interesting that the 3,000 he killed on this special occasion, when Moses is up receiving the commandments, is the same number the Lord added to the church on the day of Pentecost.
Yes.
It's kind of like, I'm going to give you back the same number of those I killed in the day of rebellion.
Yes.
Because now you're following my direction, and I'm going to give you that 3,000.
Yes.
Now, to us today, we'd say, oh, that's kind of a stretch. But if you're part of that 120 and you're all Jews of Israel, and this story we've just gone through is a major story that you grew up with. And so when the day of Pentecost is over and the Lord has added 3,000 to you, and you're Jewish, I would think you would think of this story.
Well, you know what I think of is, in comparing these two events, is we're just, as Paul says, that the law kills, but the Spirit gives life. And so this law that they were under, 3,000 died under this law, and then on Pentecost, 3,000 live just after the Spirit comes upon that assembly.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's why we collaborate together.
Yes.
Feed off each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something there, Mike.
What's interesting too, since we're talking about that, where the two sons of Aaron were slain, or Phineas and Hophni, also under the Old Testament, because of showing a gross disrespect for what God was establishing there, and what two people were killed in the New Testament when they showed disrespect. And so 2 and 2, 3,000, 3,000. It's like, you know,
it's kind of like the Lord is in the New Testament purposely tying into these Old Testament stories to the Jewish Christian church now.
Yeah.
Stories that they were very familiar with.
Yeah.
And you know, these same principles are still in effect. So it's interesting, the language, even at the end of verse 28, 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Well, on Pentecost, 3,000 fell in obedience. Or added to the church.
Right.
So we have to fall one way or another, don't we?
Well, you mentioned in a previous episode, the stone either falls on us and grinds us to powder, or we fall on that stone in repentance. Yeah.
We all have to do something with that stone, and all of us are going to fall either on it or it's going to fall on us. But all of us need to fall. Connection to that.
Yeah.
Every knee shall bow, every tongue confess.
Yeah,
we can do it now for our benefit,
right?
Then for our judgment.
Yeah. Willingly is his, for his glory. When we have to, it's not for his glory at all.
So Moses says, verse 29, verse 30, I'm going to go back up before the Lord and make atonement, see if I can make atonement, covering for your sin. So it's interesting. It's going to attempt to atone for their sin. Back to chapter 31, the previous chapter, it called Bezalel to make the altars, the mercy seat, Ark of the Covenant, the things of atonement in the tabernacle. And I was going to try to find atonement for the people even before those altars are built, the tabernacle is even built. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, oh, these people have sinned a great sin. Well, he had already told the people in verse 30, you have sinned a great sin. So let me go back to the Lord and ask for atonement, forgiveness, mercy. So he goes to the Lord, these people have sinned a great sin, made themselves a god of gold. Yet now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book, which you have written. Now here is true intercession.
Yes.
Like Paul, in Romans. I wish myself could be accursed if it would mean for their salvation. And you wonder if Paul, in writing that in Romans, was thinking about this passage, that he wanted to be like Moses. I want to have the spirit of Moses when he went back on the mountain on behalf of the people. I want that same frame of mind. I really think he probably was thinking of this.
And in a sense, I look at that as blot me out of your book of receiving the inheritance, to go on into the land and receive the promised inheritance, willing to forfeit that blessing. And actually, he pretty much got what he prayed for.
Yeah. Yeah, he
Yeah.
did, huh? I mean, basically, in our language, he's saying, you do whatever you want to me,
Mm-hmm.
but please have mercy on these people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
yeah.
Yeah.
So he says in verse 34 or 33, the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. Now therefore go lead the people to the place of which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit for punishment, I will visit punishment upon them for their sin.
Mm.
So this is kind of maybe a veiled reference in some degree, but the principle of it is developed even later in Deuteronomy, but especially in the later prophets, the idea of the day of the Lord, when his judgment on all wickedness begins to take place. So this is a very familiar story, but it has very deep lessons for us. And it's interesting that if any of our viewers want to do this for your own benefit, because it take too long to go through it ourselves, but in Deuteronomy chapter 9 and 10, Moses looks back at this 38 years later, just before they go in and just before he dies. And so he goes back in all through this chapter. He says in verse 8 of Deuteronomy 9, also in Horeb you provoked the Lord to wrath, so that the Lord was angry enough with you to have destroyed you when I went up into the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant which the Lord made with you. Then I stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water. Then the Lord delivered to me 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God, in which were all the words which the Lord has spoken to you in the mountain from the midst of the fire in the day of the assembly. And it came to pass at the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave me the 2 tablets of stone, the table of the covenant. The Lord said to me, arise, go down quickly from here, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have acted corruptly. They have quickly turned aside from the way which I have commanded them. They have made themselves a molded image. So he's just recounting. He says in verse 15, I turned and came down from the mountain. The mountain burned with fire. And the 2 tablets of the covenant were in my 2 hands. And I looked, and there you had sinned against the Lord your God, made yourself a molded calf. You turned aside quickly from the way which the Lord commanded. So I took the 2 tablets, threw them out of my 2 hands, and broke them before your eyes. And I fell down before the Lord as at the first 40 days and 40 nights. So here is not so much is even more detail than given back in Exodus, that he fell down for an extra 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water because of all your sin which you committed. I was afraid of the anger of the Lord. But it says at the end of verse 19, but the Lord listened to me at that time also. And he says in verse 20, I prayed for Aaron, which might give us a clue as to why, part of the reason why Aaron was spared. And so it just goes on to recount what we already looked at. But he says in verse 24, you have been rebellious against the Lord from the day that I knew you. Boy, that's quite a statement. Been rebels all along.
And he's talking to this generation that would go in. And you and I were talking prior to our session that these kids, well, they were born 20 years prior to going in, 20 years or younger. So they were 20 years removed from this calf incident. And yet when he speaks to them, he's speaking to them in the corporate, because they're part of the corporate. But I think if we draw anything out of this lesson is you can be in the corporate and well on your way to receiving the promises, the inheritance and such, but you may not be among those who make it. So within the corporate, there are the individuals who have to decide whether to be loyal to Yahweh or to chase after, something that glitters. And so these were allowed in. Of course, we know what was coming for them too. They would be facing a lot of these same temptations, and many of them would not make it. And so hence raising up judges, raising up prophets. But to our church members, we can't push them across the finish line, and nor can we push ourselves. We've got to let, within a New Testament assembly, we can only encourage those within the corporate to be among those who are successful, who are actually overcomers. That takes a personal surrendering and falling on the stone, like you said. Pastor can want all he wants, but they've got to want it as badly as the pastor wants it for them.
So that brings up maybe one last thought before we sign off, is that you're right, he's speaking to the next generation. Yet he seems to be describing them in much the same way as the previous generation. And you talked a little bit more about the future history of the people. Had this same spirit all the way to Christ. Rarely did they break free of this rebellious spirit. They had brief times of revival, godliness, but for the most part, this rebellious spirit stayed with them all the way through. And the reason I bring that up is it might give us a deeper clue as to what Jesus meant in Matthew 24:34 about this generation shall not pass. Because that's a real sticking point in Matthew 24. Atheists love to use it to disprove the scripture, because they say, see, that generation did die and all of that did not come to pass. So then many of us come along and say, no, he's talking about the generation alive when all of these things are happening. But I think we might be limiting that idea of this generation, thinking of it the way we think of a generation, like 40 years or 70 years or something. No, he might be talking about this kind of people that is represented by that, literal generation when Jesus came, but it was a spirit that had been with them all the way through. So this generation in Matthew 24:34 may have a broader, deeper, more dimension to it. It's talking about a kind of rebellious spirit, not just in Israel, but in us today. That this kind of generation, this kind of race, this kind of people, this kind of spirit is not going to pass away until after Jesus comes back. So just give that some thought to all of you. Think about maybe a little broader truth that Jesus was trying to get across, that all of us have this in us. It's really not going to be generally removed until he returns and there's a resurrection and we get new bodies, and Israel is regenerated as a nation. And then finally, Israel and all the saints, resurrected saints, are finally going to be free of this rebellious spirit that we have.
Yes.
That may be a little bit more what he was talking about there.
Yeah, good thoughts, brother. Good thoughts.
Anyway, that's the golden calf. Maybe we said a few things that generated some good thoughts to all of you. But
we do have a picture that maybe we'd like to share just before we
please. I
close.
forgot to bring that up, please.
Maybe we'll just we'll share it right now. Let them get a
Yeah,
visual
sure.
of it, and then we'll just unshare it and we'll
Speak
close
to
out.
it a minute.
Okay. So we're going to share an image that is in that locality, they believe, of where all of this took place. And so the two gentlemen that were there that visited this site seem to think that this might have been where the offering of the calf took place. So I'll share this. I'll share this with you. As you can see here, here's the chain link fence that the Saudis have put around this whole area. And in that video that we showed a while back, several sessions ago, with the rock that split, this is down below that rock. That rock was on a 100-foot mound off in the distance here. But here we see some signs of carvings of cows here. So as Brother Rick said, they saw firsthand Egypt worship these images, these cows and such. They had their Apis bull and such. And God showed his displeasure with the whole mess already to them. But here they are. So it may have been this area here that they had offered up the calf. We don't know for sure, but we know Israel's presence was certainly in this area. So we thought we'd just show that to our viewers. And
yeah, we don't know how big the calf was. It may have not been real large. It's called a calf. But if it was up on that top flat rock, it'd be up like on a pedestal and on a general mound there. So it'd be visible for a long distance to where a lot of people could gather, dance, and have their orgies and parties and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Around that calf on top of those rocks.
Yeah, this whole area, this whole encampment area was large enough to handle that many people, a couple million people. So, and then off from this location, they discovered those two men also. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was about 4 miles from here. They located a mass grave. And so it's quite possible, given all the other evidence here, the split rock, the water that gushed down, the stones that were smoothed out from the water, all of that, it's quite possible that the gravesite would be the 3,000 that were killed. And so it's just evidence that Lord, I think, is revealing now in these last days for all the naysayers out there. Oh.
Good. Thank you, Mike.
You bet.
And thank all of you. We look forward to our next session. We maybe want to tease this a little bit. We won't even give the name yet.
Okay.
But we have another interview lined up. It's going to be 2 weeks from today. And we look forward to that interview. And as soon as we have that completed enough, we'll let all of you know, so that you look forward to not having to just look at our two faces. There'll be another third face.
Yes. Yeah. And I will say that our previous interview with Brother Dillard was met with great success. It's got a lot of views.
Yeah, a lot
thank
of good
you for
response.
all that. Yes, thank you. Yes.
Thank you to Brother Dillard again.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Anything else, Brother?
No.
Yeah.
You can sign off.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thanks for viewing, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.